Hi there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec, and today I want to talk to you about something that might be holding you back from finding the best cards for your deck. Don't worry though, it's not your fault. Allow me to explain. As a quick introduction to the premise here, one of my favorite ever quotes comes from the Vlogbrothers channel, where in one video they said, "Text means nothing without its context." In that specific video, John Green was discussing a line from a character in one of his books, a line that got pretty popular online, which kind of startled him, because that line comes pretty early in the book, and the line was a belief held by the main character, which the book itself would then go on to interrogate, deconstruct, and show how it's a very bad idea, actually. Out of context, people reacted to that line from that character, the philosophy that they espouse, completely differently when that line was on its own, versus when that line was surrounded by a whole book's worth of plot that examines its weaknesses. And we see this in tons of other ways too. A world-class violinist playing on a stage versus in a subway station elicits a very different type of response. Or the way that you react to the art piece right behind me. You might react to it very differently if you saw it hanging up in a museum, because of our cultural feelings about museums. And if you want, by the way, check out Marcel Duchamp's Fountain from 1917. It has a lot to say about the way that museums affect artistic reception. It's wild. Alright, I know, cool story, bro, but how is this relevant to Magic? Well, today I kind of want to apply that lens to Magic cards. How does the context or the lack of context surrounding these cards affect our impressions of the way that they work together? I mean, to start, at base level, we all know that cards are specialized, and you need the right deck to make most of them tick. For example, Rooftop Storm would be really bad in an Artifacts deck, but it would obviously be terrific for a Zombies deck. The card Currency Converter struck me as an interesting but altogether underwhelming card, and then I saw it in a Quintorius deck, where it made like 14 tokens in a single turn. Cards are never bad or good purely in a vacuum. There are obviously really big standouts that feel amazing just about anywhere, but even stuff like a great counterspell can actually be made to feel a little bit awkward if you play it in, for instance, a Cascade deck, where cascading into that good counterspell kind of feels like a little bit of a whiff. So taking that as a base understanding, knowing that cards depend upon their surroundings to really live their best lives, what I'm especially interested in is how context affects our first impressions of a card, and how a first impression then goes on to shape the card's potential and its popularity. For example, in the new MKM set, we're getting a card called Escape Tunnel, a strictly better version of Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse. Given that those two cards respectively appear in more than 770,000 and 570,000 decks, that's 22% and 16% inclusion amongst all decks in the EDH Rec database, you'd anticipate high hopes for the future of Escape Tunnel, right? Well, probably not, because of the context in which we're receiving that card. Expanse and Wilds have the benefit of being super easy to acquire. They've been printed in tons of products for tons of years. And while I certainly bet that Escape Tunnel will be just as budget-friendly of a card to acquire, the reality is we're getting that card as one obscure common in a set full of tons of other more interesting cards. And I'd personally wager that in future products such as pre-constructed decks, if Wizards prints any of these options, they'll opt for the classic, treating Escape Tunnel more as a one-off than as the new industry standard going forward. We see this a lot with good old-fashioned Cancel, right? That's a very simple, easy-to-grasp effect, and a terrific introductory card for new players, even though it's atrociously bad compared to all the other counterspell options out there, even just sticking to other common counterspells that also cost 3 mana. But Cancel remains more popular than tons of those other options because of the context of it being an introductory card and its ease to acquire, given its surplus printings across tons of sets. Additionally, the way cards come pre-packaged together biases their ability to be lumped together more easily in deck data later on. You've probably heard us talk about the precon effect many times before on the show, cards showing up in each other's decks more often because they came in the same precon together, but this happens on a set-by-set basis a lot too. For instance, when Cheville Bane of Monsters was released in Ikoria, his deck data included the card Heartless Act. Now that's a nifty card, but I think it's safe to say that these two do not get along with each other very well. Cheville puts counters on things to kill, and Heartless Act cannot kill things with counters on them. You'd be better served with just about any other kill spell in this card slot. And yet a quarter of Cheville decks were playing it. That's not truly even that high of an amount, but it's still higher than I'd have expected, right? Maybe people just like it for the flavor, never gonna knock you for that, but these cards just don't cooperate with each other. And over time, Heartless Act has indeed inched down to a 6% inclusion rate in Cheville decks. I think that movement downward over time shows us that not all those players were choosing it just for the flavor, but rather that those cards' sheer proximity to each other influenced how they were perceived and how they were used. Over time, their distance increased to the point that it probably should have been at from the start. But it's obvious how we got those initial numbers, right? Players opened new stuff, built decks out of what they had easy to hand, and slapped it into a deck together. No big deal. And truly, it's not a big deal. Like, full T, building decks super casually like that is really cool. But it is interesting, and it's instructive for us to observe how our own deck building impulses and decisions might be influenced by those contexts, by the water that we don't realize we're all swimming in. How the first impression that we have of a card can be governed by more than just the text of the card itself. Here's another. Remember when the first Commander Legends came out and so much attention went to Jeweled Lotus and Opposition Agent, so much so that Hullbreacher wasn't pinging very much on the radar? And of the three, Hullbreacher's the one that actually caught a ban. Even just the fact that Jeweled Lotus has the word Lotus in its name affects our understanding of that card, because it invites us to make a mental connection between it and the OG Black Lotus. Since Oppo Agent and Jeweled Lotus took up so much of the discussion mantle before Hullbreacher was even previewed, I can't help but wonder if the conversations and our reactions back then would have been different if those three cards had been revealed in a different order. I certainly think Hullbreacher is the kind of design that absolutely would have warranted a ban either way, but I wonder if Opposition Agent wouldn't have been at the forefront of that conversation, despite the fact that it eventually seems to have self-selected into specific playgroups, if it had been previewed after Hullbreacher had been previewed. The first Commander Legends is honestly a terrific case study for context affecting reception, especially because so much of the marketing involved designers saying the set contained, quote, powerful white cards. I personally am surprised that the marketing failed to acknowledge that the set contained more powerful non-white cards, but, you know. In truth, that set contained powerful white card. And no, it wasn't Keeper of the Accord. That card is very okay, but it's not the savior that players wanted it to be. Akroma's Will was actually the noteworthy card. But players didn't really focus much on that one at first, did they? Because we were all told to expect cards that might fix, quote, the Boros problem. And Keeper of the Accord was therefore the one that got the most hype. And that card was showing up in like every white deck after that set released. Its popularity was off the chain. And now, years later, Akroma's Will has proven it's the real star, showing up in more than twice as many decks as the Keeper. The circumstances around Commander Legends feel to me like a very big example of specific expectations causing the actual important cards to slip past notice, and we only properly evaluated those cards a good deal later. Honestly, I think Mutate is another really strong example of this exact situation as well. Ikoria came out when everyone was stuck at home, and the only way to play Magic with those new cards tended to be on Arena, which handles a lot of the complexities of Mutate on your behalf. A mass introduction to Mutate in paper events might have produced a slightly different reaction than Mutate received when it first came out, when it was primarily seen on a digital platform. Alright, those examples are probably a little heavy-handed, so here's one that's a bit left field. How do you feel about the initiative mechanic? This is a polarizing one, and for good reason. Playing a single initiative card suddenly introduces a monstrous amount of extra text into the game. I have a party deck, and I don't play Seasoned Dungeoneer in that deck, even though it came in that precon, despite how good that card is for party synergies, because I just can't be bothered with the extra fuss of the initiative in the average Commander game. I feel the same way about one-off Night and Day cards, to be honest. Playing a single card with those extra things that you have to track just isn't worth the hassle for me. And I'm saying this as an initiative fan. Baldur's Gate is one of my favorite ever draft sets, and in that draft environment, initiative is hella fun. It helps the game move along so well, and even if it's a lot to track, I find it a total blast when so many different cards interact with it. But I want to draw a distinction there between the feeling I have towards playing one-off initiative cards versus a limited environment where tons of cards are dedicated to the initiative, or even one-off initiative cards versus dedicated initiative decks. My family has a Rilsa initiative deck, and it's bonkers good, and it's a lot of fun to play against too. It's not just a couple one-off cards that make you track a bunch of extra text, it's a whole bunch of cards centered on an unusual strategy, and that forces you to approach the game in a new and interesting way. So again, context is king. I simultaneously love the initiative when we commit to the bit, and I also avoid it like the plague because it's an absolute mess when taken in small doses. Now that's one way that different surroundings can affect our emotional responses to a group of cards, but now let's explore how different situations can affect our actual card evaluations. Remember Monologue Tax? One of my co-hosts has gone on full tirades about this card. Matt Morgan is more like Mad Morgan when it comes to Monologue Tax. And important to our conversation here is that this card was printed in the Osgir Lorehold Artifacts Precon, a deck that cared very, very much about artifact cards, making copies of artifacts, having metal stuff in your graveyard. It doesn't really give a crap about enchantments. Even that deck's secondary commander, Alibu, does not make great use of this enchantment outside of the general use of treasures being some extra mana sometimes. Now compare that impression to if, say, this card had been initially printed in, for instance, the Precon deck with Marneus Calgar, which draws cards when you make any type of token, or if it had been introduced in the Onyxia deck, who could manipulate the fact that this is an enchantment. Would that have changed your initial impression of this card if it had extra benefits with the commander that it was introduced with? It's not just that this card is made better in one deck versus another deck. That happens all the time. I have a friend playing this card in their Benny Brax deck, and eventually I even tried it in my Thalys deck for a while too, because in those decks, the token aspect matters a whole lot. In those circumstances, our understanding of the card isn't just about value for value's sake, we start measuring it in completely new ways. What I'm getting at is that it actually took me a while to take a chance on this card in my tokens deck because of my original instinct when I first saw this card in the Osgear Precon. It took time to mentally divorce that card from its artifact deck origins. Might we have reacted differently to it, made those connections faster, if we saw it introduced in a different way, such as alongside a commander who makes better use of its characteristics? Would we have felt differently about it if it was released in the main set instead of in a precon? And it's worth pointing out, too, that Monologue Tax wasn't just introduced in the context of the Lorehold deck. It was introduced in the environment of players feeling a certain type of way about Smothering Tithe, and in the milieu of players feeling a certain type of way about Boros' capabilities in Commander. Monologue Tax doesn't meet the standard of a Smothering Tithe, nor does it fix what people perceive to be Boros' problem in EDH, and therefore I'm not surprised to see people like Matt react to this card the way that they do. I don't think Monologue Tax is really all that amazing, but I do think the way that we were introduced to it really hammered our ability to see what it could actually be good for. And let's be honest, this happens the opposite way a ton of times too. I think we've all had the experience of seeing a card do amazing work in another person's deck, which excites us to go get one and run it too, only to discover that in our own deck, maybe it doesn't perform as well. Because sometimes we don't realize right away that there's something very specific about the way that that person built their deck to enable that card that our deck doesn't inherently have. Even if two decks are both Spellslinger or both mono-green Stompy, subtle things like mana curve, payoff density, or tempo are harder to observe from just across the table, and they can radically change how good a card is in those two different decks. Alright, let's go back a little farther for another example. We all know Azuri's Predation is a fantastic card now, but I remember when this card came out and it was largely met with a vague disinterest. Maybe not by all playgroups, but it certainly didn't leave a big lasting impression when I first saw it, not with my friends or when I went and played out at game stores. In fact, the biggest thing I think I can say about that card is how infrequently I saw that card when it was released back in 2015. And looking at the price charts, it was less than $1 for years. I think part of that stemmed from the fact that it was released in the old Azuri Claw of Progress deck, a deck that cares about playing creatures with power 2 or less. And okay, side tangent, but Azuri's Predation is one of the reasons why I don't like this Azuri commander one tiny little bit. Every other face commander that year got signature cards that enable their abilities, but Azuri's signature card, which is such good green design, doesn't enable his ability, which feels like a sign that maybe something is kinda off. The entire weight of this game's history shows a consistent pattern of green and blue combined caring about big creatures, while creatures with power 2 or less are clearly the Borosest thing that ever Borosed. They had the opportunity to make an awesome set of enemy color precons that really capture what those color pairs are about, but Simic stole Boros' design space, so then Kalemny got stuck with a theme of, giants I guess, ? I wish they'd given the Boros commander the tiny creature experience trigger and the Simic commander the big creature experience trigger, and then started the designs and decks fresh from there. Like when one of your commander's best experience enablers is famously a color pie break that the lead designers are really unhappy about, I just think there's something not right. Anyway, I know this is all dumb noise from products that are literally a decade old at this point, but I just think it's a bummer that one of the reasons that Boros was dealt such a crap hand for so many years was because, when it was presented with opportunities to shine, its slice of the color pie was usurped by other colors to create legends that don't even work with their signature spells. And that brings me back to the point at hand, Azuri's Predation. When it came out, it had the impact of being less than $1 for years and years and years. It had the context of not being good for the commander deck it came in. Just look at how many Azuri decks go out of their way to take that card out of that precon. Now, over time, we all caught on and realized that, hey, this card slaps actually. It eventually rose up to be a $20 card before it finally caught a reprint. But the fact that Azuri's Predation didn't trigger the very commander it names, and that it feels awkward in the deck that it came in, is what I think contributed to it slipping under the radar as a great commander card throughout the 2015 to 2017 era, where Monologue Tax had a huge set of expectations placed upon it, inviting folks like my co-hosts to eagerly try it out only to discover that it falls flat without a very specific support system. Azuri's Predation was more obscured, causing people to miss how good it can be in all kinds of decks until it finally, after a lot of time had passed, got some independent scrutiny separate from its origins. This obviously isn't the case for every card that comes out in a way that's a little bit odd. For instance, if you haven't heard it already, the Command Zone's Rachel, Murph, and Damon did a terrific pre-con evaluation episode last year, and in one especially hilarious moment, they comment on the card Bitterthorn, which was released in a Blighted Brimaz deck, where its super does not shine. The card almost feels perfectly sculpted so as to not trigger that commander's abilities. It's obviously an excellent card though, and showing up in 22,000 decks and commands a $10+ price tag. The context of that card's introduction to us is mega awkward. Brimaz really didn't highlight what makes that card shine. But commander players are savvy, and big cool cards like these don't slip by us quite so easily anymore. But I actually think this is kind of related to yet another thing that has a big effect on our card evaluation, and that's the classic, endlessly discussed aspect of Magic design these days, which is of course, the overwhelming number of products we get. And I don't want to litigate that very much, it's been talked about to death as a topic, but I am at the very least interested in how that circumstance affects the way that we as players perceive card power and the way that we identify synergies between cards. I said Commander players have gotten more savvy, and I meant it, but I also think we've kind of had to, because otherwise the relentless pace of set releases will just cause a whole bunch of stuff to pass us by. For example, we mentioned the precon effect earlier and the set proximity effect earlier, but we also sometimes get forgotten set syndrome. Take the Aftermath set, which has been remarked upon as an afterthought set. There are some dang cool designs in this set, but the way the set was crowded out made it feel very sidelined, so a lot of those cool designs pass unnoticed. Or heck, if we're talking about forgotten set syndrome, the king of it all has gotta be Unfinity, right? I guess at the last minute they decided to turn the set into black border instead of silver border. But look at this set's numbers. Saw in Half is the most popular card from the set, and it's a big drop off after that point. These cards are not well loved. It really gives me the vibe that no one wants to go near this set, even if some of the cards would be okay in their decks, just because the circumstances surrounding the Unfinity set invites more cynicism than joy. Like truly, if you want a lesson on context affecting the way that we respond to cards, the change from silver border to black borders with an acorn symbol is a huge one, right? I'm actually a big fan of the unsets. Unstable is an amazing draft experience. But with Unfinity, the thing that bugs me about the change from silver border to black border acorn symbol isn't even how it's just obviously a corporate decision to try and squeeze more money from the product. The thing that I think is the biggest travesty is the way that a black border undercuts our ability to appreciate the cards on the level that they want to be appreciated. When you look at a card and see a silver border, it pops, and without any extra brain power, you're immediately clued into the fact that what you're about to read is going to be a joke with a punchline. Whereas when you look at a card with a black border, you engage with it the same way that you engage with any Magic card. Your eye travels down the card naturally, which means you read the name, see the art, read the text, and then you look down and see a little acorn symbol, and it makes you reevaluate what you just saw. If the text was a little bit odd, before you see that symbol, you're caught in this moment of, wait, was that a joke? And then you have to look for a little symbol to signify whether the card thinks it's funny or not. You've gone from knowing you're about to read a joke to being told afterward whether or not you read a joke. The comedic framing device has been completely removed. We've gone from the experience of going to a comedy night to instead going into a theater where we're not sure if we're going to get a slapstick routine or a couple serious monologues. And worse than that, it makes some of the comedy feel inconsistent too. It very subtly causes us to compare jokes against each other, which isn't the way that I want to engage with comedy. Like stickers are something we're supposed to take more seriously than fluoros of Mira's Marvels? If they were both silver bordered, I wouldn't bat an eye. I'd just lean back and enjoy it. But when I see a different treatment for these things, I naturally start to wonder, well, why? And I don't know, stickers feel way more like we're being silly and having a devil-may-care kind of time compared to fluoros, which for all the world feels like it really could have been just a regular black bordered card. Though at the end of the day, I guess I'm glad that we don't have a bunch of surprise new partners. And I know there are so many designers who worked hard as hell on Unfinity and who felt so dismayed by the way that set was received. But a joke set that no longer preps its audience for the jokes it's going to tell, that's nothing but a recipe for disaster. And it's not the audience's fault for responding in that way. Like, I don't feel this way about any of the other silver bordered unsets, you know? Like, I don't want to apply this level of scrutiny to every card that I see. I go to the unset specifically because I want to kick back, kind of turn my brain off. But in this case, it felt like I couldn't. To engage with the product at all, I felt like I had to engage with them more critically, to sift through and pick out which one of them is a joke in the first place. When you change the way that something is framed, in this case, literally changing the frame from silver border to black border, you change the way that the audience is going to engage with it. And in this case, it felt like instead of knowing that I was going to receive comedy, I had to go searching for that comedy. And when you're searching it through something, when you're looking more closely at it, that means you're more likely to find the flaws. And it means that potentially, if you didn't get what you expected, since you were searching so hard, it means that you're more likely to feel let down. As long as we're talking about the way things are framed and sets with rocky releases, I mean, to an extent, Baldur's Gate had this kind of problem too. A lot of its initial negative reception was a big imbalance between people's expectations for what would be in that set versus what was actually in that set. A lot of its initial negative reception was blamed upon it having Commander Legends in the name, which people felt meant it must have, for example, really big reprint value, the way that the first Commander Legends set did. That's not a perspective that I have shared personally. I actually find myself pretty strongly agreeing with this quote by Dan Sheehan from the Commander Sphere, now called Pie Break podcast. Go check him out, he's terrific. Like him, I didn't feel the words Commander Legends implied what other people felt it implied. It did kind of seem to be conflated with Commander Legends means there will be Masters level reprints in the set. And to me, I just felt like Commander Legends only ever meant draftable Commander. I mean, I want better reprints in just about any product, obviously, but precons have been shaky on that front before, so I didn't have a huge expectation. In fact, I kind of thought it might go like the way of Conspiracy 1 versus Conspiracy 2. Conspiracy 1 had really good reprints to make sure that it sold, but then Conspiracy 2 had okay reprints and amazing new card designs, and that's kind of what I felt might happen here. Sorry, I know I'm waffling here a lot, but I guess I just want to complete the thought that, like, if they had named it just Battle for Baldur's Gate, I think a lot of people would have been confused why the name doesn't clue you into the fact that it's a set where you draft a commander deck. But regardless of that, I can certainly say that this set's release was definitely a cluster fork, even if I don't necessarily agree about what was the primary culprit. The context that I feel is most important is like the set's price, its impact on game stores, and especially how it was trampled by another premium set right on its heels that very same summer, Double Masters. I just don't think that the name is the primary lesson that we want Wizards of the Coast to take away from how that all was handled. Now, we've already examined Baldur's Gate plenty on this channel. I promise I'm not trying to linger on this as a subject. The topic just felt incomplete without a discussion on Baldur's Gate because of its reception, because of players' expectation based on the way that that set was framed. Because the way that people react to those cards now is very different to the way that they reacted to them when they first came out. We saw so many people labeling it as one of the worst sets ever, claiming that every card in the set was underpowered trash and that the set had literally zero saving graces. But with some distance, years later, especially after the video game Baldur's Gate 3 came out, I've seen a whole lot of those very same people change their tune, finding cool gems from that set and trying to pretend that they never had anything bad to say about it in the first place. I just kind of can't help but wonder if we might have reacted to the set differently if it had been released in the same time frame as the video game. Or if Double Masters hadn't been previewing cards at exactly the same time, coming out barely a month apart, fighting for the same limited supply of oxygen. I think those are important details for us to keep in mind when we consider our reactions to new game pieces. Clearly, the way that they are framed, the way that they're marketed, our expectations all affect our engagement and our evaluations of new cards. And it's important to be aware of what's actually influencing us in those moments. Under different circumstances, we all could have fallen in love with various flopped sets if they weren't created in environments that restricted our ability to connect with them. And by the same token, I hope that being aware of those surrounding influences and the baggage that we each bring into new sets can also help us stop from falling too hard for new cards that aren't actually all that great. Like when Wizards released Alms Collector and people thought it would change the face of white decks, only to discover that it's actually a very mid card. Or when Wizards released the card Bootlegger Stash, which had a pre-order price of like $50, and that card is just okay. The conversation that was actually happening around that card was that people were kind of flustered by green making treasure tokens, because it feels weird. Like, green abhors artifice. Green is the color of nature. You'd expect that its mana production is always going to be organic. And also, it doesn't need extra help anyway. So why is it getting treasures? Like, that was the conversation. But if you clip things out of context enough, all you'll see is that there's a lot of hubbub about Bootlegger Stash. And that is what twisted the conversation into people thinking that everyone was uppity about the card because it was OP. What started as a discussion on color pie turned into a truly undeserved pre-order price. This is why you should always be at least a little bit dubious of narratives on social media, by the way. Like, if you see posts clipped out of context, you are being misled. That platform is designed to do that, to make sure that you misunderstand and therefore to make you spend more time on that platform. Don't fall for it. Try and get the full context every time. And being aware of all this, I think, helps us have more productive conversations about cards when we're trying to evaluate them. I didn't give Currency Converter the time of day, but I saw it do really great work in a very specific deck. I'm glad to have that experience so that I don't just write it off forever and miss potential times where it could be useful for me if I'm building my own weird niche deck. Or when I say, I think Corrupted Graphstone is a bad card, it helps if I specify further. It's not that I think the card is bad because it only belongs in niche strategies, the way that like Rooftop Storm only belongs in zombie decks, but rather I think it's a bad card because it performs poorly even in those niche strategies. Acknowledging the best case context allows us to more properly evaluate that actually, yeah, other mana ramp cards are still going to help you out way more in those scenarios. And I also think this awareness can help us make sure that we don't accidentally get swept up in hype cycles that wind up affecting our judgment, like with Commander Legends 1 and all of those cards, or with the Green Treasures thing. It can literally save you money if you're able to pause and zoom out, acknowledge the surroundings, and see how those surroundings are affecting the conversation. When you see a new card, don't just evaluate it by itself. Evaluate also how the cards around it affect the way that you feel about it. Ask yourself if you would feel differently about that card if it was released in a completely different product. And do the same when you're looking at its popularity. Is a card popular because of the circumstances of how it was released? Is a card unpopular because it's been buried by a bunch of other things that were surrounding it? Trust and hone your own evaluations, because there are a lot of reasons that mediocre cards will take up a bunch of room under the spotlight, and a lot of reasons that good things get missed. Evaluating a card sometimes also means evaluating all of these strings that are attached to it. Text means nothing without its context, and cards mean nothing without their context too. Let me know your thoughts on this subject below. Like and subscribe to appease my dark patrons so that I can maintain my warlock powers, and thank you so much for watching. And as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.